Well, Sunday was a bit of a barnstormer. To go from the game between Aston Villa and Manchester United to the game between Brighton and Spurs was a little bit like watching paint dry to watching, well, Brighton versus Spurs. But that's neither here nor there. We're not here to talk about Villa Manchester United. Brighton 3, Spurs 2, Spurs leading the game 2-0 half time, looking like they could go on and if anything, it wasn't a case of if they were going to beat Brighton and go on to complete the job, it was how much they were going to beat them by. Because that first half was near enough all Spurs. Brighton did grow into it a little bit, but nothing that made you think a turnaround like this was imminent. But I don't know what changed. In the second half, something just dropped for Spurs. It's not even going to be so much tactical what I'm speaking about when I discuss it. I don't know, just something dropped. Mentality, heads, confidence, composure, anything really. Check out any sort of mental buzzword that you can think of to use. All of them are sort of applicable at this point. But fair play to Brighton, they held on in there, got through a pretty poor first half. Hurzeler made some pretty bold decisions with the substitutions and little tactical changes, and it paid off. And you have to give him full credit towards that. And he got the best out of the attacking quality against Spurs' back line. But we're going to go over how Spurs took the lead in the first half. The Spurs would build up as they typically would in their sort of 2-3-2-3 with the fullbacks inverting alongside Bentancur in the holding midfield position. And Brighton would press high, they'd go man to man all over the pitch, being really aggressive. And in the first half, this was a negative because the intensity in the press wasn't great. And the certain players that they picked to come out of position to try and mark and press the Spurs players didn't really work out. And it felt like they were sort of caught in between pressing and staying in shape at points. It was my interpretation of it, but it feels like Hurzeler doesn't want players to come too far out of their sort of zones. So, for example, a common move for Spurs is on this left-hand side. Udogie moves further up into the sort of left half space, attacking it centrally, and Maddison will come in alongside Bentancur to get on the ball here. So let's just say when Spurs playing out, they could find that pattern here. Minter wouldn't look to drop all the way onto Udogie, and Baleba wouldn't want to come all the way up into Maddison, coming too far out of their sort of positional zones. So those interchanges of positions could really catch Brighton out, and the overload that obviously Spurs can create in those central areas. Now, to be fair to Brighton, I think a reason they might not have wanted to do this is because they didn't want to create too many open passing lanes to players in higher up positions for Spurs. But it just felt like they were caught in between two stars with the pressing and the zonal shape. And as a result, they got caught in between neither. So passes could come from this area. So let's say Maddison could maybe look around the left-hand side to play it to Werner or Udogie, or maybe even the right-hand side, slip the ball into Solanke. Bentancur could maybe make this little movement in here, which would maybe open the space up on this side for either Kulusevski or Porro to show for it. So all these little subtle movements they could use to sort of open Brighton shape up. And as well, there would be cases if Kulusevski would come in a little bit too far deep and again interchange with Porro the way that Udogie and Maddison could on that left-hand side. And Igor wouldn't want to come up to press Kulusevski too high. So Kulusevski, Bentancur and Maddison could outnumber Baleba and Hinchelwood with Ruta staying high up on Van der Ven. So it was all these little moments within the game that they just managed successfully, Spurs, and they could get openings galore in the midfield and really start to open Brighton up. And once they did beat that initial Brighton press, Brighton would drop into shape, and this is what it would look like. It would be a similar shape for Spurs, just pushed higher up. Brighton would drop into more of a mid 4-4-2. They'd still have a relatively high defensive line, but there wouldn't be as much pressure on the players in possession of the ball in deeper areas for Spurs. Welbeck and Ruta would maybe look to try and block the pass into Bentancur. Maybe you'd get one marking with the other going to close the ball down. And the midfield four for Brighton were caught time and time again against this Spurs midfield because they still followed the same principle where they didn't want to stray too far from their positional zone. And Spurs exploited that. So sometimes you get Pedro Porro coming out quite wide into this area where Matoma would sort of half press into these areas, not want to get caught too wide, creating too much space in between himself and Hinchelwood that Kulusevski could work in, where that pass could come in here. Hinchelwood would have to cover around. And the vertical movements between these guys as well would catch Brighton out, which would make it easier maybe to create passing lanes into players higher up the pitch. So let's just say if Maddison and Kulusevski were within two separate horizontal zones, dragging Hinchelwood and Baleba apart just enough that Romero or Van der Ven could play this pass into Solanke. And this is where the overload really didn't help Brighton whatsoever, is you could have Solanke dropping in, maybe drawing out Lewis Dunk with him to really outnumber the Brighton players. Bentancur could maybe move in. So it was so packed in that midfield for Spurs, and Brighton in this shape couldn't really get close. They were always outnumbered, always had a player extra to deal with than they had at their disposal. Kadioglu and Veltman were pinned because of the wingers, and it became a nightmare. Spurs won that midfield battle clearly in the first half, and they were finding passes all around. As much as Brighton did maybe keep a compact shape from attack to defence, without any real pressure on the ball, sometimes it doesn't matter how compact your shape is. And to be fair, where they could really hurt this Brighton line was with the movement of Werner and Johnson in behind, as typically Solanke coming out to this area would draw Lewis Duncan. He could maybe release the ball to Bentancur, maybe to James Maddison, who could then fire that ball over the top into Werner, who could run off the back of Veltman, who he was doing for pace all game. Veltman just doesn't have the physical capabilities to keep up with him, and would look to get in the box, create shooting opportunities for himself, or to find Brennan Johnson on the far side. Kadioglu was losing Brennan Johnson all game. It's no wonder he got subbed off at half time. He really struggled defensively in this side. And Werner must have gotten in behind like this about 5 or 6 times in that first half. Just that high line, the lack of athleticism in it. Veltman and Dunk, players on the other side of 30, struggling to deal with it. A lack of end quality really stopped it from being a bit of a cricket score. And on the right-hand side for Spurs, it was again another case of opening Brighton up. So you get Pedro Porro maybe coming in a little bit narrow here. Let's say Christian Ramirez on the ball. You'd get Brennan Johnson coming in quite deep into this area here to receive the ball outside of Matoma, who would look to come in central if Porro was there, which created a massive gap between himself and Igor, which if this pass went into Johnson, he could then maybe look for the movement inside as Matoma would react to Pedro Porro, and Kulusevski would attack this space in behind that Pedro Porro or Johnson could find the ball either side. Kadioglu got far too tight to Johnson. He didn't manage space between himself and the centre-back well enough, and got caught consistently with this. Kulusevski was found in this area so many times. Hinshelwood not reacting well enough at points to get in, and Kulusevski really creating some dangers from this right-hand side, dribbling it as man one-on-one, taking it inside and outside, creating a space for the shot for himself, or to cross it into a teammate, or to pass it to James Maddison, who, with the quick little switch of play, had time to create something from his positioning with the run of Solanke maybe, with Werner, and he also got a goal which Verbruggen should have done better with. But full-back areas were a bit of a nightmare for Brentford, and the high line really not doing well with the lack of athleticism they had in it. But it dropped off in the second half. Brighton subbed on a Stupinian for Kadioglu, and he was managing Johnson a lot better, not getting in far too tight to him so that he could read the pass that Johnson was going to make down the line. Baleba was moved more towards Kulusevski as well, and he was tracking his run more into that half space. And so Spurs weren't opening them up anywhere near as much. There was a lack of real just tempo with the way they played the ball as well, and just opened the door for Brighton to come back, which they did, and I'll discuss how they did that now. Now, Brighton would look to build up in a sort of 2-4-4 with Ruter and Welbeck in the forward line against the Spurs back four, Minter and Matoma wide, Hinshelwood and Baleba narrowing up, and Igor and Dunk spread. Adam Webster did start the game, it's important to say that, but he went off very early with an injury, hence why it's probably fair to put Igor in from the start with this. Spurs would look to go man-to-man, press high. Solanke would go between the centre-backs and the goalkeeper. Verbruggen would get involved in the build-up. Maddison and Kulusevski on Baleba and Hinshelwood, Johnson on Kadioglu, Werner on Veltman. Bentancur would sit in a little bit deeper to try and stop any pass going in to Welbeck or Ruter. And I have to say, Bentancur in that first half was really, really good. Mopped up in between the lines really well. Just sort of if, say, Iger could try and find this angle through the middle of that shape in the gap between Kulusevski and Johnson, then he would quickly shut off that lane into Welbeck or maybe even Matoma, and did a fantastic job. Really managed that well in the first half. It got a little bit worse as the game went on, but that may not be his fault, as we'll touch on in a second. And the back four against the front four, as you'd sort of expect. And also, let's say if Solanke was on Lewis Dunk and the pass from Verbruggen went to Igor, then you get Johnson pressing around to try and stop Igor from playing the ball forward, and then Porro would come across to Mark Kadioglu and press him, that Romero could then switch across. Bentancur still remaining vigilant in the centre of the pitch to block those easy passes and still making it a fair numbers game. The same would happen on the right-hand side for Brighton, left-hand side for Spurs, where the winger would press the centre-back on the ball and the full-back would cover him. Brighton could do one of two things. They could go direct to either Welbeck or Ruter, who have really good physicality in their back-to-goal play and can contest the ball physically. Didn't win a lot of their duels in the first half, but they were still a threat and they were still a presence that Brighton could look to play to. Or another way that they could play up through the press is by getting Baleba on the ball. Now, there is a slight Yaya Toure-ish quality about Carlos Baleba. He was a player that did not make an impact on me at all last season. Few games for Brighton this season, I'm starting to see it a bit with him. I'm starting to see it. There's still a bit of a rawness about him. There's still like little bits of quality that he needs to work on. I still think his passing can be a bit hit and miss. It's improving. It's improving, but sometimes he just doesn't get the technique. He doesn't get the weight of it correct. But his physicality to ride the press from anyone coming up against him and quickly use his physicality and his balance to shift past him and run up the pitch with some impressive running power is an amazing quality to have. And he did manage to get the ball up the field for Brighton a number of times doing it this way, just running into the space in behind the midfield and in between that and the defensive line for Spurs and create from there. Sometimes the movement of Spurs was a little bit lacking. And what this then did to Spurs was it then forced Bentancur to maybe have to come up to Baleba and sort of prevent his run from causing any real danger. The Spurs back four would then narrow up, coming into Ruta and Welbeck. Pedro Porro maybe coming in even if he was caught up the field. And this then created a bit more space in the wide areas, and Baleba could fire these passes into Minter or more commonly into Matoma. Matoma had a fantastic game. His one-on-one dribbling to go inside and outside, and not just one-on-one dribbling, is one-on-two, one-on-three to weave in and out of tight spaces. Let's just say if Romero came across the cover, he could manoeuvre his way in between Porro and Romero, constantly just finding an angle for a cross, for a shot. And he did put in a number of crosses in the first half, which weren't met by his teammates. A late run, just a real lack of concentration prevented those from becoming dangerous situations. But full credit to him, and he was a danger man all day for Brighton. Especially if Johnson was caught pressing the centre back, he'd have a bit more freedom to do so and cause a bit more indecision in that Spurs back line. But again, they managed to get through it in the first half, Spurs, fairly easily. That occasion didn't happen too often to the point where it was an overly concerning thing. But I don't know what happened in the second half for Spurs. It was really poor, and I'll just sort of readjust the shape now to demonstrate it proper. That Spurs weren't pressing as high, they weren't as aggressive when trying to get the ball back off of Brighton in the second half, and they were ending up in a bit of a 4-1-4-1 shape. And the space that Bentancur had to try and manage between defence and midfield was a little bit too much at points. Now, Brian could get the ball to the fullbacks quite easy, as Werner and Johnson were staying narrow, weren't tracking the fullbacks well enough at all. Baleba and Hinch were, to be fair, taking up pretty intelligent positions, causing that midfield to have to be really cautious of them. But Veltman could move up into these advanced areas here to get on the ball against Werner, who wouldn't do a great job of tracking him. As I said, same for the left-hand side, Estupinian coming on for Kadioglu against Johnson. He could then drive the ball forward or look to play a quick pass into Minter on the outside. But to be fair, Veltman's movement into these areas could also force Minter inside, dragging a Dogian centrally that Veltman could then run off into space. Couldn't really get too far off of Werner because in a one-on-one sprint battle, it's obvious who's winning that. But he could find that space and did manage to exploit it well. Another thing was that Ruta and Welbeck, who were stuck to Romero and Van der Ven in that first half, were coming in a lot deeper into these spaces in between, outnumbered Bentancur, who got caught in between the two of them all half. And again, just that space he had to deal with, that real issue that was developing between these two. And they played really well off of each other. There seems to be a really good understanding between Ruta and Welbeck already. And them getting on the ball between the lines, easily manoeuvring past Bentancur with this man advantage. And there was a real lack of intent to engage from Romero and Van der Ven. For some reason, they didn't seem as keen on being the aggressor, whether that's because they were frightened of the pace of Matoma and Minter to really exploit the space they had left in behind, especially with Minter coming in a bit more narrow in this position. If Van der Ven went to press Ruta or whoever, Minter could then make this movement off of him. But even still, the fact that even if they weren't going to go and engage, a midfielder not dropping in to help, Bentancur got left on an island. And Ruta again playing off this well enough that could find the pass into Minter down this side or play the ball back to Veltman on the right, or Baleba getting on the ball to then capitalise on Spurs' shape narrowing up and play the long ball over to Matoma on this side, who, as I was saying before, had a fantastic game, used his dribbling ability well, and the fact he was afforded more space by these quick movements didn't help that cause at all on a Spurs perspective. It only gave Matoma more room and more time to succeed in what he was already doing really well with. And as a result, these openings, along with some really silly individual mistakes and performances from that entire back line, just nowhere near good enough. Like, on a personal level, Ange needs to do something. I'm a massive Ange fan, and I feel like I've even defended Ange against certain criticisms. he can't keep accepting that this is okay just because this is the style that he wants to play in. It's becoming too easy. They're becoming too vulnerable, and they're losing games this way, and they will continue to lose games that maybe they shouldn't have, based on the fact that this backline is so vulnerable without a real holding with it. Bentancur has done really well, but it still feels like you need someone who's a little bit more natural in that position. I don't really feel like Bentancur's a 6 in the traditional sense. And look, fair enough, they won't make the individual mistakes like they made in this game every game. It just goes to show that when the one mistake happens, and then all of a sudden how easy it feels for Brighton to manoeuvre in, that's a problem. That's a problem. And Ange needs to address it. He can't just keep saying mate in his press conferences, making us all fall in love with him as if that's okay. It's something he's got to work out and he's got to make better for Spurs. Otherwise, they're going to keep losing games, and we know what happens when that happens. But let me know what you guys think. I'd love to know your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Dislike it if you disliked it. Comment down below and tell me why either way. Subscribe if you want to see more. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now, lads.